A man discovered something unsettling in his cellar, decades after his father vanished without explanation. George Carroll is said to have vanished from his Long Island home in 1961, and his family claims he was never seen again. After George vanished mysteriously, his 4 children were troubled by it for decades. However, it wasn't until nearly 60 years later that Mike, George's youngest son, discovered something startling in the Carroll family home's basement. Welcome to USA Stories channel. Do not forget to subscribe and activate the bell button to receive all new updates. Now let's go to the story. George's birth year was 1934. He served in the Korean War, which raged from 1950 to 1953 after he was an adult. George had made Lake Grove, Long Island, New York, his home by 1961. He resided there in a modest home on Olive Street, a suburban street. At that time, George Carroll, his spouse Dorothy, and their 4 kids, Patricia, Jean, Stephen, and Mike, made up the Carroll family. In 1961, all of the Carroll children were quite little. Patricia, the oldest, was 9 years old, and Mike, the youngest, was barely a year old. Though they were young, the Carroll children's lives were about to undergo a permanent transformation. 1961 was a year to remember in a lot of ways. A few months later, in April, Soviet cosmonaut Yuri Gagarin became the first human to journey into space, and in January, President John F. Kennedy took office as the 34th President of the United States. While these 2 historical events were important, the Carroll children will be most impacted by events that occurred closer to home. This is due to the fact that their father George reportedly vanished from their house in 1961 and never came back, leaving only a trail of unsolved questions in his wake. Following George's disappearance, it seems that his spouse Dorothy informed the kids that their dad had one evening gone out to get cigarettes and had never returned. Strangely enough, it's believed that he misplaced his wallet. Mike, Dorothy's 8-month-old son, never entirely accepted her story because of how strange it seemed at the time of his father's supposed absence. Despite being bombarded with inquiries, Mike and his siblings received minimal responses from Dorothy. In November 2018, Mike revealed to the New York Post that his mother was reluctant to discuss his dad's purported disappearance. He said, "I was always told, don't ask, so I stopped asking." Surrounding their dad's departure with an air of mystery, the Carroll family was also full of rumors. According to reports, several family members thought George had left his family and gone to Korea, where he had fought 10 years before. A darker rumor, however, proposed that George had died and was interred beneath the family's basement, which was being built at the time of his disappearance. Furthermore, it was later claimed that no one had reported George missing after his unusual disappearance, meaning that the appropriate authorities were probably unaware of his disappearance. Because of this, the family started to move on in the years that followed, even though there were still unresolved issues regarding George's location. Then, shortly after George was said to have disappeared, a guy by the name of Richard Darris moved into the Carroll residence. He ended up being Dorothy's second husband, and the 2 eventually had a child together. The mother of 4's marriage to Darris, however, did not end happily, and it eventually collapsed. In 1983, Dorothy eventually filed for divorce from her second husband. 20 years after Darris moved in with the Carroll family, their relationship seemed to have soured. Indeed, it seems that Dorothy had doubts about Darris's faithfulness, and at some time in the late 1970s, she had requested him to leave. According to reports, Darris relocated to Nuevo Laredo, Mexico, following his divorce from Dorothy. Situated just south of the state of Texas, the city is near the U.S. border. Darris got married again, nevertheless, prior to their split in 2000. His new wife asked for a temporary protection order against him, according to court documents that Fox News was able to obtain. The Carroll children ceased asking questions as they grew older, and their mother Dorothy continued to believe that George had deserted them. In November 2018, her son Stephen told WABC that there wasn't much to talk about for a while, but we became curious as adults as to where he might be. In June 2018, Darris passed away at the age of 77. In the meantime, his ex-wife Dorothy had died in 1998. Mike, her youngest son, had bought the Carroll family's Olive Street house before Mom passed away. Before he started to doubt whether his father could actually be buried beneath his home, He had been living there for nearly 20 years. Mike told WABC of the claims that his father's last resting place was in the family basement, saying it didn't just come up overnight. The topic has been discussed for many years. In his explanation of the theory, he went on, "This is something as we grew up, we've heard multiple stories. So in the middle of the 2010s, Mike made the decision to dig the basement in an attempt to find some answers. But soon after the job started, he had to give up on his ambitions. According to Mike, I was actually digging in the wrong spot, as he informed News 12. So I got to the point where it became dangerous because I was afraid my house was going to cave in, so I stopped digging." Nonetheless, Mike and his family never stopped up trying to find the truth. That being said, the Carroll family later went back to looking for George's supposed remains. But this time, they hired a variety of specialists to assist them in finding any hints, and throughout, Mike performed the arduous work himself, laboriously lifting the bulky concrete basement floor piece by piece. One of the specialists Mike called in was a ground-penetrating radar operator. With the use of electromagnetic radiation, this technology creates an image of subsurface structures by scanning below the surface. The apparatus discovered an enigmatic bulk 6 feet below the basement floor when it was employed in the Carroll's space. Following the advice of one of his sisters, Mike sought assistance from a psychic at another time during his search. Mike is a licensed respiratory therapist and a strong believer in science, but he was open to hearing the clairvoyant's perspective. He acknowledged to the New York Post that premonitions, gut feelings, and things like that exist. Additionally, Mike later disclosed to News 12 that he had witnessed ghosts in the house when he was younger. In another eerie tale, he stated, "My friend came from Georgia and he said, 'Mike, I came out of your bathroom. I saw a guy standing there like, a shadow of a man standing and walking down the stairs.'" Still, Mike finished, solidifying his skepticism with, "But that's neither here nor there. According to Mike's explanation to the New York Post, there was a guy who came to my basement and he went to the right spot and said, 'The energy is here.'" This was all during the paranormal investigation. However, Mike had regrettably experienced a stroke by this time. As a result, he had his adult sons, Christopher and Michael Jr., take over the search. Mike detailed his son's involvement in the expedition to News 12, a local news station, in late 2018. "Guys, come on over here and help me out," I said to my kids. "You've been observing my actions." "You enter here," he said. I believe they were sorry for me. It appears that they eventually hit upon something when Mike's sons were excavating in the location that the psychic had selected, since they knew how important this was to me. Christopher and Michael Jr. discovered something several feet below the surface that they thought would be interesting. They informed their father, who hurried from upstairs to the basement. "It's not easy for me to get up and down the stairs," Mike later admitted to News 12, but he was still keen to see more. "It's true that I entered the hole where they were excavating," he disclosed. Mike came to the realization that the artifacts that had been discovered might actually be the remains of a human. Subsequently, Mike told the New York Post about the macabre sight of the bones, describing them as twisted in a knot, weird-looking. It was not completely exposed, but rather twisted and down in the ground. Mike made sure his siblings were the first to hear about the horrifying find, and they notified the police the following day, which just so happened to be Halloween. The provenance of the bones could not be readily verified by the Suffolk County Police Department. However, the cops did explain that they indeed appeared human, and with that stated, they would need to conduct out DNA testing and maybe check dental records too before they could declare for certain who or what the bones belonged to. But Mike was certain the remains were his father's, even in the absence of such proof. "It's going to be my dad," he told the New York Post with assurance. "This is going to be a terrific thing for him to be emancipated from that environment where he didn't belong," Mike continued, revealing that he was able to view the revelation positively. As a matter of fact, Mike felt completely at ease after learning of the identity of the missing bones. He told News 12 at the time, expressing his feelings, "I feel vindication for my dad. It seemed to me like he was dancing in paradise." Therefore, it is unlikely that he felt more at ease until professionals verified that the remains were, in fact, those of his father. Suffolk County officials declared in December 2018 that the skeleton belonged to George. Even after nearly 60 years, the DNA was incredibly well preserved within the skeletal remains, County Medical Examiner Michael Kaplan told Newsday. And so it appears that Mike and his siblings have at last located their father, 60 years after his absence. Mike was relieved to get some of the long, nagging questions he had been asking answered. He told News 12 that he had taken a chance. "I could have searched all this way and come up empty-handed, but then my basement would have been completely disorganized. I have a messy basement, but I'm really happy we found what we did," he continued. "It calms my family down. Even though the Carroll family probably won't know the whole truth about their father's passing, the autopsy sheds some light on the matter. The medical report states that George was murdered, and the blunt instrument injuries on his head is evident in his remains." Experts added, though, that the impact might have occurred after George had passed away. Mike wasn't completely astonished to learn of George's injuries, despite the fact that some families may have been shocked. This is due to the fact that he had heard this theory before. The New York Post was informed by the psychic that the injury was caused by blunt force trauma, he said in December 2018. "She genuinely told me that it was a pipe, that he was buried alive after being struck in the head by a pipe. Based on the evidence that Mike and his boys found, it appears that the family's search for their father has turned into a police homicide investigation." Mike later said to News 12 in response to the revelation, "There are so many loose ends here. A story exists that is hidden within a story within a narrative. In the meantime, the police have their own hypotheses, according to the Washington Post. For example, it seems that they would have loved to speak with Darris, Mike's ex-stepfather. Nevertheless, they couldn't question him because he had just died. Mike has therefore maintained an open mind on the situation. At this moment, I'm attempting to refrain from assigning blame," he stated to Newsday. The Carroll family chose to keep their speculations about George's possible whereabouts to themselves while the authorities carried out their inquiries. They were just relieved to have discovered him at last, after all that time. Mike told Newsday, "I feel great that my dad is free from that crappy hole at last. Besides, Mike doesn't think his father's killer will be apprehended because a lot of people who were nearby when his dad vanished have already passed away. Justice will not be served," he stated to the New York Post. "We just stopped the ideal crime, so justice will be served when we find him. They nearly got away with it, too." From this perspective, Mike has been able to rejoice at his family's eventual sense of closure following the discovery of his father's remains. He told the New York Post, "I tell my sons we hit a grand slam in the bottom of the ninth with 2 outs. We win because we found our dad." Stephen, Mike's older brother, who was 5 years old when his father vanished, also felt the same way. November 2018, he told the New York Post, "It just struck me that he's been here the whole time, and it's wonderful. The grandkids can now say that Papa has been found." Though Stephen is relieved that his father's remains have finally been found, he can't help but be troubled by the memory of George's last moments. "How does something like this happen?" he questioned in a Newsday interview. "How can one get rid of someone? Bury them in a basement, cover them with concrete, and no one ever finds out. The Carrolls can now consider finally burying their father, even if there are still a lot of unanswered questions. Along with a military service, they intend to bury him in Long Island's Calverton National Cemetery." Mike told WABC, "I want him to be in the military. I hope he receives what is rightfully his." Please remember to subscribe to our channel, give us a thumbs up, and turn on the notification bell so you won't miss any of our videos. If you enjoyed the tale, the next video that plays on your screen will probably move you too.